The call came at 6:47 in the morning, and I remember that detail because I'd been awake for an hour already, sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee, trying to figure out how I was going to make rent and still cover my mother-in-law's birthday dinner that weekend. My phone lit up with my husband's name, which was strange because he was supposed to be in the next room sleeping. Then I heard a voice that wasn't his. It was a nurse. She said the words carefully, the way people do when they've been trained to deliver them, and I sat there at my kitchen table with the cold coffee and the open laptop showing my bank balance, and I just stopped. Everything stopped. My husband, Derek, had collapsed in the parking garage at his office building. He'd gone in early to finish a quarterly report. He was 34 years old, and he had a congenital heart defect that nobody, including him, had known about. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. The weeks that followed are something I still can't fully account for. I remember flashes. I remember his mother, Vivienne. That's what everyone called her, though her name was actually something longer that she'd shortened years ago. I remember her arriving at her house that first afternoon wearing a black dress like she'd already known to pack one. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to notice. I remember the way she looked around our living room, at the pictures we had framed on the wall, at the furniture we'd picked out together, and the way her eyes moved felt less like grief and more like inventory. Derek and I had been married for 4 years. We'd met at a fundraiser for a local food bank. He volunteered there every other Saturday, which was the first thing I loved about him. He was steady and funny, and he made pancakes from scratch on Sunday mornings, and he always remembered which of my friends had birthdays coming up. He was the kind of person who made you feel like the world was slightly better organized than you'd feared. His mother had never fully approved of me. She hadn't been subtle about it. At our rehearsal dinner, she'd pulled me aside and told me she hoped I understood what I was taking on, as if Derek were a liability and not a gift. Over the years, she'd made small comments about where I'd gone to school, about the neighborhood we'd chosen to live in, about my job in nonprofit communications, which she referred to as that little charity thing you do. Derek always defended me, always quietly and firmly, and afterward she'd act as though nothing had been said, and we'd all move on. I thought that was just how it was going to be. I thought I could live with it. I did not know in those first terrible weeks that Vivienne had already begun meeting with lawyers. We had a will. Derek had been meticulous about that sort of thing. He worked in financial planning after all, and he said it was embarrassing for someone in his field not to have their paperwork in order. We'd done ours together 2 years into the marriage, at a firm downtown. Everything was straightforward. The house, our joint savings, his 401k, his life insurance policy, all of it was arranged so that I would be taken care of. He told me that explicitly. "I don't want you to ever have to worry," he'd said the night we signed, and I'd told him he was being morbid, and he'd kissed my forehead and said being morbid now meant neither of us had to be later. I found out about Vivienne's legal maneuvers from an unexpected source, Derek's younger sister Penny. Penny was 26, still finishing a graduate degree in environmental science, and she and Derek had been close in the uncomplicated way that some siblings are, texting each other memes, calling on Sunday nights, showing up for each other without making a production of it. She'd been devastated by his death. She was also, I would come to learn, the only member of his family who had any real interest in telling me the truth. She called me about 6 weeks after the funeral. I was back at work by then, or trying to be, doing the thing where you show up and answer emails and eat lunch at your desk and wait for the day to end so you can go home and fall apart in private. She asked if she could come over, and when she arrived, she sat across from me on the couch with her hands folded in her lap like she was about to give a presentation she hadn't wanted to prepare. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to know that I'm not part of it. I want that to be very clear." What she told me was this: Vivienne believed that Derek's life insurance policy, a policy worth $850,000, had been improperly designated. She had hired an attorney who was preparing to argue that Derek had been under undue influence when he updated his beneficiary designations to list me as sole beneficiary rather than splitting the proceeds with his family. Her argument, as Penny understood it, was that I had manipulated Derek into changing the designation shortly after we married, and that his original intent had been to provide for his mother. I stared at Penny for a long moment. I tried to understand what I was hearing. "She's contesting the beneficiary designation," I said. Penny nodded. She looked miserable. "She hired someone from a firm that apparently specializes in this. They sent a letter to the insurance company last week. Derek changed that designation himself. I wasn't even in the room." "I know. We were at his financial planning firm. His colleague processed it. Derek told me about it afterward at dinner. I didn't ask him to do it." "I know," Penny said again. "I believe you. That's why I'm here. The thing about grief is that it doesn't leave you alone, even when life demands your full attention." I had to find an attorney while still crying in my car on the way to work. I had to gather financial documents while still waking up at 3 in the morning reaching for someone who wasn't there. I had to function fully, completely, with paperwork and phone calls and strategic thinking, while also being a person whose entire future had been dismantled without warning. My attorney was a woman named Miss Alderton. She came recommended by a colleague at my nonprofit, was straightforward to the point of bluntness, and had exactly the kind of energy I needed in those months. Not soft, not gentle, but clear. She reviewed the situation and told me that beneficiary designation challenges were genuinely difficult to win, but not impossible, and that the key factor would be demonstrating Derek's consistent independent intent. "We need to show a pattern," she said. "Not just the designation itself. Emails, conversations, financial records, anything that establishes that this was his decision, made clearly and without pressure." I spent 2 weekends going through every document Derek had ever filed, every email he'd ever sent, every note he'd jotted on the legal pad he kept on his nightstand. And that's when I started finding things I hadn't expected. Not about me. About Vivian. The first thing I found was a series of wire transfers. Derek had kept meticulous personal financial records, spreadsheets, PDFs, everything organized by year in labeled folders on his laptop, which I had the password to because we'd always been open that way. Going back almost 3 years, there were transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Not enormous amounts individually, 5,000 here, 8,000 there, but they added up. Over 32 months, Derek had quietly, consistently sent his mother a total of approximately $74,000. I didn't know about this. Not because he'd hidden it exactly, but because our finances were managed jointly except for our individual spending accounts, and this had come from his. He hadn't lied, but he hadn't told me either, and I sat with that for a long time before I understood why. There were emails too. I found them in a folder he'd labeled simply, "Mom, Important." They went back 5 years, before we were even married. In them, Vivian asked for money with the particular skill of someone who had practiced asking, never demanding outright, but framing everything as a crisis, a temporary situation, something that would resolve itself soon. And Derek, being Derek, had quietly handled it each time. In several of the emails he mentioned that he hadn't told me, and in one he wrote something that lodged itself in my chest and stayed there. "I know this isn't fair to Simone. I'm going to talk to her about this. I just need to find the right time." He never found the right time. He ran out of time entirely. Here's what I understood, reading those emails. Vivian's legal challenge wasn't grief. It wasn't even really about the money, not at the core. It was about control. Derek had been quietly, steadily creating a life that was more mine than hers, and the insurance policy was the final proof of that. By designating me as sole beneficiary, he had made a legal declaration about whose future he was responsible for. She couldn't undo his death, but she could try to undo that. Ms. Alderton, when I brought her the emails and the financial records, was quiet for a long moment. "This changes things," she said. "I'm not sure how. It establishes that she had a dependent financial relationship with him for years. It also raises a question about whether she had something to gain by contesting early before you could have discovered any of this. I looked at her. What does that mean? It means her attorney may have advised her to move quickly. If she could get a settlement before you dug into his records, she might have gotten something. Now she's going to have a harder time arguing that Derek's intent was unclear when there's 3 years of documented transfers showing that he managed her financial needs separately as a son, not as someone providing primary support to a dependent. The legal process moved slowly. That's the part they don't tell you when you're watching procedural dramas. The weeks of filings, the requests for documentation, the waiting. My mother flew up from Albuquerque to stay with me for a month, sleeping in the guest room and making her green chili chicken soup and not asking me questions I couldn't answer. My friend Margot, who had known Derek almost as long as I had, came over every Thursday night and we watched old movies and she let me talk when I needed to and didn't push when I didn't. I kept going to work. I kept showing up. What I didn't do was engage with Vivienne directly. Ms. Alderton had advised against it, and more than that, I had nothing left to say. Every version of a conversation I could imagine ended with me either apologizing for something I hadn't done or screaming something I'd never be able to take back. So I said nothing. I let the lawyers talk. There was a mediation session scheduled about 4 months after Vivienne's initial filing. I drove to the building in downtown Chicago. We lived in the north suburbs, but the attorney's office was in the city, and I sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I could make myself go in. I thought about Derek running drills at the gym in this same garage district, coffee in hand. I thought about the Sunday pancakes. I got out of the car. Vivienne arrived with her attorney and what I can only describe as a performance of composed grief. Appropriate clothes, careful posture, the particular expression of someone who believes they are being wronged. She didn't look at me directly when we entered the room. I sat across the table from her and thought, I don't hate you. I don't even fully blame you. But I will not let you do this. Her attorney led with the argument they'd been building, that Derek had been a devoted son who had always intended to provide for his mother, that his marriage had altered his priorities in ways that didn't reflect his true wishes, and that the beneficiary change had occurred under circumstances that warranted scrutiny. Ms. Alderton was quiet through most of it. Then she placed a folder on the table. We'd like to enter into the record 38 months of documented financial transfers from Derek to his mother, totaling approximately $74,000, made from his personal account, she said. We'd also like to enter a series of emails between Derek and his mother spanning 5 years, in which Derek repeatedly fulfilled requests for financial assistance and also noted his intent to be transparent with his wife about these arrangements. The most recent of these emails is dated 11 months before his death. She paused. Derek's beneficiary designation is consistent with his role as a husband providing for his spouse. His financial history shows that he fulfilled his obligations to his mother separately and consistently over many years, without ever framing those transfers as a substitute for spousal support. There is no evidence of undue influence. There is considerable evidence of deliberate, independent planning. The room was very quiet. I watched Vivienne's face and I saw, underneath the composure, something shift. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was the particular expression of someone who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. Her attorney asked for a recess. They were gone for 40 minutes. When they came back, he said they were prepared to withdraw the contest. There were no celebrations. There was no moment where I felt triumphant or vindicated or even particularly relieved. I walked out of that building and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and I cried, not for winning, but for Derek, for all the things he'd been quietly managing, for the right time he'd never found to talk to me about his mother, for everything we hadn't finished saying to each other. I went home. My mother had made soup. In the months that followed, I thought a lot about what it means to know someone. I had known Derek. I had known who he was, the texture of his daily kindness, the way he moved through the world, and I had not known everything about him. Both of those things were true at the same time. He had protected me from something, and that protection had come with a cost I hadn't known I was paying. I didn't know how to feel about that, and eventually I stopped trying to resolve it into a single feeling. What I knew was this: he had made his choices clearly. He had done, in the careful and meticulous way he did everything, what he believed was right. He had left me the documents. He had kept the emails. Whether he'd known that someday I might need them, I couldn't say, but they were there. I used part of the insurance proceeds to pay off the house. Our house, the one with the furniture we'd chosen together and the pictures on the wall. I set up a small donor fund at the food bank where Derek had volunteered, and every other Saturday I go in and do the shift he used to do. People who knew him tell me the same thing, that he was one of those people who just showed up, quietly, consistently, without needing credit for it. I already knew that. The last time I saw Vivian was about 6 months later, at a distance. She was leaving a restaurant near Derek's old office as I was walking past, and we made eye contact for just a moment. She looked older. I probably did too. She didn't stop and I didn't either. I don't know what she tells herself about what happened. I don't know if she believes she was wronged, or if somewhere underneath everything she knows she went too far. That's not mine to carry anymore. What I carry instead is this: a house that's paid for, a folder of emails I've read so many times I've memorized them, and the particular complicated knowledge that love isn't simple and grief isn't clean, and the people who show up for you, quietly and without fanfare, are worth every ordinary moment you get with them. Derek showed up for me. He showed up for me even in the paperwork, even in the careful labeled folders, even in the email he never finished the sentence of. That's enough. Some days, it's more than enough. I used to think that doing the right thing protected you from consequences, that if you were honest, if you showed up, if you loved someone without an agenda, the world would more or less leave you alone. Derek believed something like that too, I think. He was meticulous and steady, and he handled things quietly, and for a long time that was enough. What I understand now is that doing the right thing doesn't protect you from anything. It just means that when things fall apart, and they will, in ways you never planned for, you have something to stand on. Vivian's challenge wasn't random. It was the result of years of choices, hers and Derek's both. She had learned, over a long time, that Derek would handle things without confrontation, that he would absorb her needs quietly and not make anyone uncomfortable about it. That pattern had consequences. It meant he never told me about the transfers. It meant she believed, perhaps sincerely, that she had some claim on his future. When he died, she moved immediately, because she had learned that moving first, before anyone could ask questions, was how things got handled. But Derek had also made choices. He had kept the emails. He had labeled the folders. He had, in his careful and organized way, left a record of everything, not because he anticipated dying at 34, but because that was simply who he was. His integrity wasn't something he performed. It was something he practiced in spreadsheets and labeled PDFs and emails he wrote at 11 o'clock at night, trying to figure out how to be fair to everyone. That record saved me. Not luck, not timing, the accumulated evidence of a person who had lived honestly. I think about that when I consider what it actually takes to get through something like this. It's not enough to be angry, though I was. It's not enough to feel wronged, though I was that too. What carried me through those months was something more specific: the willingness to sit down with documents I didn't want to read, to understand a situation I hadn't chosen, to build a case carefully instead of just reacting. Grief wanted me to collapse. I couldn't afford to, so I learned things. I asked questions. I paid attention to details that felt unbearable to look at directly. Penny showed up and told me the truth when she didn't have to. Ms. Alderton was direct with me when directness was the only thing that would actually help. My mother made soup and didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. None of those things were dramatic. All of them mattered enormously. What I know now, on the other side of it, is that the qualities that get you through the hardest moments aren't the ones that look like strength from the outside. They're quieter than that. They're the willingness to keep going when keeping going feels like the least reasonable option. They're the honesty to look at a situation clearly, even when clarity hurts. They're the basic decency to treat the people around you, your spouse, your sister, your client, like their lives are real and their needs are legitimate. Derek had those qualities. He wasn't perfect, and his way of handling things cost us both something. But he was fundamentally decent, and that decency outlasted him in ways he never knew it would. I go to the food bank on Saturday mornings now. I do the shift he used to do. It's a small thing. It's also, I found, exactly enough.